This is Research Like a Pro, episode 163, Tracing 19th Century Germans, Part 4. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you doing today?
Doing well. I am excited to talk about DNA today, so I thought I would tell you guys some of the fun things I learned in my IGHR course last week about ethnicity, since we'll touch on that today. I don't know if you guys have heard, but Family Tree DNA has said that they're coming out with a new chromosome painter that will have a chromosome painting of your MyHeritage populations. And so that's exciting because that's one of the really unique tools that 23andMe has had, their ancestry composition painting. So it'll be nice to have that in another database as well at Family Tree DNA. So we're looking forward to that. And Paul Woodbury, he gave us a whole lecture on how he used that 23andMe chromosome ancestry composition painting to kind of help him narrow down some really important clues for an African American research project. So it was cool to see it in action.
Oh, I would have loved to have seen that lecture. That sounds great. And Paul's a really good teacher.
Yeah.
But I also love that 23andMe tool, and I have used that for some research projects. So it's exciting that Family Tree DNA is going to have one as well. So I've also been doing a little DNA stuff. I'm getting ready for a presentation as part of the UGA's big conference in September, and they asked me to teach a class on pedigree triangulation. So that's really fun. You know, we have a whole section in our new book, Research Like a Pro with DNA, about pedigree triangulation, and I use that in 2 or 3 of my projects. So anyway, it was fun putting together the syllabus, and now I get to put together the presentation. So it's kind of been fun to return to some DNA stuff.
Well, welcome back to Heidi Mathis. She's going to be talking with us today about using DNA to help us with our German research. Hi, Heidi.
Good to be back.
So let's jump right in. What do we need to think about when we are going to start researching recent German ancestors when it comes to using DNA? And maybe we should define what we mean by recent.
Yeah, so with autosomal DNA, we're looking at, anywhere between the past 5 or 6 generations just to be safe. And when we're using with German DNA, DNA has obviously been an amazing tool that helps us solve our genealogical brick walls. In the last episode, we talked about how I could use it for my ancestor Burkhard Schlag, and I couldn't find his church records, but I could find records of his nieces and nephews, and the fact that my dad and my aunt had pretty good connections with those nieces and nephews gave me the confidence that there was a family connection. And so, you might be able to use that with some of your German ancestors, but in general, Germans have an advantage with church records and other documentary evidence, but I have found that you're at somewhat of a disadvantage with German ancestors when it comes to using ethnicity and DNA. There's just a lot less people of German ancestry taking DNA tests. I've noticed of recent German ancestry. For instance, my dad, he has 7 great grandparents who were of recent German ancestry, and at Ancestry has 300 fourth cousins or closer. So I think that's a lot fewer than a lot of people. So some of the reasons why there are fewer Germans taking tests is that Germany itself has strong privacy laws, and that some German families had smaller families starting in the latter half of the 1800s. And so just your total pool of people is maybe a little smaller. I think that one exciting thing is that you might find more German cousins on MyHeritage because I think there's more Europeans on there. And the other thing that's really tough about using DNA with Germans is that German DNA does not seem to be very distinct. And I'm going to be contrasting that with Irish DNA, where Irish DNA does seem very distinct. And part of the reason for that is that Ireland is isolated on this island for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas Germans were in the middle of a continent surrounded by neighbors and all kinds of mixing that went on there. And so I think that accounts for why German DNA seems a little less distinct. So one of the things I hypothesized in my blog post was just kind of thinking about how could you compare a more genetically isolated place to a less isolated place, and how you could think about that when you're using DNA with your ancestors.
And that's such a good consideration. There's several things that would make DNA from Ireland different than DNA from mainland Europe, and different countries changing boundaries is just one of them. But also the fact that Ireland is an island and that there's a lot of population segments that people just have because they lived in Ireland and that kind of thing too.
Absolutely. And if you do Irish work, you definitely run into those segments that you're sharing with a lot of people who you probably do not have a recent common ancestor with, but who are all from the same part of Ireland.
Yeah. Well, ethnicity estimates, I think we have to remember, is an evolving science. And as we've all noticed that our estimates change, it's
Mhm.
kind of fun to take screenshots of what it is currently because, that's going to change in the future and it's fun to see how they evolve. But, if we do have some German ancestors, can we use ethnicity estimates at all on the websites? Or what do you think about that?
That is such a great question. And I think the general overall answer is that it's probably not going to be as useful as, say, Ireland would be, or another more distinctive group. But the first thing to think about when you're thinking about German ethnicity results is they really do mirror the history and the geography of Germany. Like we were just talking about, German lands have been a crossroads in the center of Europe. There were all kinds of trade routes like the Hanseatic League and all the rivers like the Rhine River. There was so many invasions and wars and religious differences that caused so much mixing. And I talked about that in my first blog post, and that it's kind of interesting how that shows up in the DNA. And in my blog post, I posted this really interesting graph from Ancestry's white paper on ethnicity, and it showed that it kind of averaged their German panel. And the German panel comes from people who have four German ancestors from the same area of Germany. And if you look at that overall graph of all of them, it had signals that were not just from Germany. The highest signal was from Germany, but the next highest signal was from England. And then Eastern Europe and Sweden and Norway and the Baltics, Scotland, Wales, Jewish, and France. That was kind of the order that reference panel came in on. And it just shows you that if you are totally German, if you have four German grandparents from the same area, you are not going to show up as German on an ethnicity test. And so I think we all have to just remember that as German Americans, that even though you have a lot of ancestors from Germany, you may not look totally German on your ethnicity test. One kind of interesting example I had was that my dad has a great grandfather who was from Pomerania, and that is just up on the Baltic Sea, and that was a territory of Sweden for a long time. When my dad got his ethnicity results, he had a little bit of Baltic and a little bit of Swedish in his DNA results. So I can't say for sure that great grandfather is where that Baltic and Swedish came from, but that's my guess because on MyHeritage my dad does match a lot of Swedish people, and we don't have any known ancestors from Sweden. I'll sometimes a German may have moved into that person's family tree, but sometimes not. And it just shows how those could be population segments from Sweden that got somehow my dad got. So I think that's super interesting and just reflective of the history of Germany. In my blog post, I had a second graph that showed the German reference population and how it overlaps with these other groups that it is similar to. There were, some Germans in the reference panel overlapped with the English, some overlapped with the Dutch, some with Scandinavians and Polish. And you could just imagine that the Germans who overlapped with the Poles probably were from the area that was near Poland. And so what you notice on that graph that I posted from the white paper is that the German reference panel seems to be the most spread out, and it seems to overlap with the most countries. And it just shows that it is the country in the center of all these other ethnicities. I think that that was just a great visual reference for how Germans can be so hard to distinguish from their neighbors. And so, if you have a person who has a German parent and an English parent, their ethnicities are not going to show up as all that different. But if you had someone with a Greek parent and a German parent, you are going to see some separation there. And so, ethnicity isn't like you're not going to never be able to use it. But as I notice matches that my dad has that have all German ancestors, they often have a German signal, but they have like a big English signal too. So I think you're just going to be able to use it less than some other ethnic groups.
That is so interesting. It's been fun looking at your blog posts and these images and just really imagining all that mixing. And, we use the term ethnicity estimate, but the real term is admixture, which means the mixing of all these different populations and their genetics. And it made me think of my friend who is full German. Her parents immigrated after World War II. And I remember her telling me that she got her ethnicity results and she said, it was so weird. There was all this Scandinavian DNA in it, which was really surprising to her. So I think that was probably common with a lot of Germans, just like you had that experience with your dad. And I wanted to note too that you can look at the ethnicity of your DNA matches. Like when you're looking at your shared match on Ancestry, you can see the comparison of your ethnicity as well as that of your match. And that can be a really good tool if you're trying to figure out which line they're on, if you had like the Greek and the German side, like you mentioned. But then it's also just fun to look at and to just see what other people's ethnicity estimates come out as.
Absolutely.
So, why might a German person's ethnicity show up with a lot of British in it? Because I've seen that happen as well.
Yeah, that one was the one that always kind of threw me for a loop because, my dad doesn't have very much English. He's about 1/16 colonial English, but the rest of him is German. So his particular results were that he was 67% Germanic plus 8% other associated ethnicities, like he had Eastern Europe and Baltic and Jewish. But then he was 25% Scotland and England, and he has absolutely zero recent Scottish ancestors. And so that was kind of puzzling. But then I had to remember that, England was the second most common ethnicity for a German reference panel member. And my dad would not qualify as a panel member for sure because his, ancestry is from all over Germany, and they're his great grandparents and not his grandparents. So I think my dad's results are more or less what you would have expected, but mine were, I thought, kind of curious. My mother, she could have some real Scottish in her because she had some Irish ancestors from the north of Ireland that I think had Scottish roots. But I don't think I have very much Scottish ancestry, but that's my number one category on Ancestry right now. And so, what I was kind of hypothesizing was that the German ancestry was getting a little bit more lost, maybe in subsequent generations, than the Irish was. When I compared them, I have, for me, most of my great great grandparents were born in Ireland or Germany. And looking at me shows the difference in how German and Irish ethnicity might work. My mom has 6 Irish communities on her ethnicity results, and I got 5 of them. So my great great grandparents were coming through loud and clear on the Irish side. But on the other hand, my dad had 2 German ethnicity groups, and I got 0 of those. And yet, it's still the same great grandparent difference away. And so I just think that because Irish DNA is much more distinctive, it shows up in those ethnicity results much more clearly. And I'm just going to have smaller pieces of German DNA than my dad. And so it's just not coming through in the same way that my dad's does. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting example of how it might be working in subsequent generations.
Wow, that is really interesting to think about the fact that it kind of gets lost as it gets to be smaller segments and it's passed down, whereas the Irish DNA, it still comes through pretty strong. But I think that scatter graph is really helpful for understanding that. So make sure you guys check that out on the blog post. It's from the Ancestry Ethnicity Estimate white paper.
So let's go to a little bit different part of DNA and talk a little bit about the IBS and IBD segments, which IBS is identical by state and IBD is identical by descent. Guide us through that, Heidi.
I'm just kind of theorizing here, but I like to think about German versus Irish for two reasons. One is that, as I've been saying, one leans kind of towards endogamy, not true endogamy, but kind of towards endogamy on the Irish side, and one doesn't, and that's the German side. And the other reason I look at it this way is because these are the two ethnicities that I deal with the most. And so, I just think in these terms. And so I'm trying to generalize this principle of more distinctive versus less distinctive DNA. Here's how I think about it. So, relative isolation has made Irish DNA easier to identify in DNA tests. And for a good explanation of this, Jessica Morgan has a post on using Irish DNA, and she had a great example that I would love to turn people towards. I think that when you have more isolation, that you get an accumulation of IBS or identical by state segments, which are just another way of saying that these are population segments that I think are accumulating more in an isolated place like Ireland. When you have an IBS population segment, you might share a long segment with somebody that you do not have a recent ancestor with. I've found many examples of this when looking at my mom's Irish side. What you've instead found is this population segment that's just very common in that particular part of Ireland. Cork, for instance. There seems to be a lot of people from Cork, and they seem to have some very common segments. And I think that those segments are what Ancestry's picking up on when they say, okay, this person is from Cork, is they're actually seeing that IBS segment. And so why would Germans have fewer localities like they do for Ireland has several localities, and I think there's fewer for Germany. And the reason might be that there just hasn't been quite the accumulation of those IBS segments. And again, this is me theorizing, but I'm just guessing that because Germans were probably less isolated in general, there was probably more mixing going on. When you have a segment in common with a German match on your German side, that I tend to take those seriously as probably being an IBD segment for two reasons. One is for the reason I'm saying that I think that it's more likely to be an IBD segment in the case of Germans. And number two is that there's just going to be fewer German matches. So you're just going to end up taking your German matches more seriously. With my Irish matches, I just always keep in mind that this could be a population segment, that I may not have a recent common ancestor with this person. And the only thing you could do is just try to build out your matches family trees the best you can to be able to tell.
Wow, that was a really good explanation of that. And I think it just points to the difference in research localities. In Ireland, you can pinpoint these communities, but you can't use the segments as much. Whereas in Germany, you don't get communities, but the segments are better to point to a common ancestor. So it really points to you having to have experience with working with the DNA in that locality. And you just learn that by experience because you've done a lot of these projects with DNA in these two localities, right?
Absolutely. And just like with all of genealogy, you just kind of have to have a hypothesis for what's going on and realize that you could be wrong about it, and just kind of keep those two things in your mind. But this is how I think of my German versus my Irish matches.
Well, there's another challenge you mentioned earlier with DNA evidence for German projects, and that's the fact that there could be fewer Germans who are taking DNA tests. So tell us more about that.
Yes, besides having kind of non-distinctive DNA, another challenge with German ancestors is that Germany has pretty strong privacy laws, which I don't disagree with those at all. But the outcome is that there's just fewer people who will take a genealogy test. I noticed that there's quite a few Irish people from Ireland on our ancestry. I find them all the time. Whereas I found only a few Germans on Ancestry for my dad. So other people might be luckier than that. And I think Germans in general are just a little bit more conservative about their personal information. So if you have 19th century Germans in your tree or more recent, you're probably going to have fewer useful matches and probably going to have fewer total distant relatives because fewer people are taking tests, and often Germans had smaller families. Not all German families, but a lot of German families did have smaller and smaller families. So you're just probably going to have fewer relatives than a lot of other groups. I've just found that to be the case.
Yeah, I was talking with a person who was trying to find his biological father in Germany, and he had a few matches that were, a little more distant, but then he actually targeted tested a person he thought would have showed up as his half brother, but turned out to be a more distant relationship, like a second cousin. So he's still working on it. But yeah, you might have to do more targeted testing with German DNA projects because there just aren't quite as many that are doing it.
I think so. But on the other hand, Germans have great records. And so you just have to just keep that in mind as you're going through that the DNA, you want to check it because it could be helpful, but try not to be discouraged if it isn't going to help you as much.
It's kind of a balance. You use what kind of resources you have, and sometimes the DNA is a good resource and other times it's not as useful. But if someone is listening and they have some German ancestors and they really are stymied or would love to try to use DNA, what suggestions do you have?
Well, the DNA research process is going to be the same for everyone. And if you do have a lot of German in your tree, you're probably not going to have as many. Like with my dad, there's only 300 fourth cousins or closer for him. So that's not very many. I can really spend a lot of time with each of those matches because there just aren't going to be as many, in cases like that. But it's the same for everybody. You want to start with grouping your testers' matches into clusters using the shared matching tools at the various testing company and just seeing the people who are related to you and related to each other. And you want to do your best to figuring out where those clusters go. And then the second really important thing to do, I think, if you have German ancestors, is to upload your test to MyHeritage, because not only are there going to be, in my experience, more Germans that you're going to be connecting with from Germany, but you can also filter for different countries. And so you can filter for people who are living in Germany today. My dad also tested at 23andMe, and actually his ethnicity results were really good, I thought, for his German ancestors at 23andMe. But, since people don't post their trees as much at 23andMe, it can be a little less helpful. But yeah, if I had a German ancestor client, I would definitely want to see if they would be willing to post their tests at MyHeritage.
We tell all of the people that we work with DNA to make sure their DNA is on all the different websites, because you really never know where that good match is going to pop up. So it just makes sense if you're really trying to break down a brick wall to get your DNA out there in different places. So that's really good to know that you have discovered more helpful people at MyHeritage.
So tell us more about how you can use MyHeritage and some of the things that you've done.
Yeah, what I like to do is filter for the largest segment on MyHeritage, as well as looking for people who share the most DNA, because often people with the largest segments are people who have a more recent common ancestor with you. So I filter for that. And then I also like to filter for Germany, and I like to look and see who pops up there with the largest segments. But I also like, depending on the person and his family tree I'm researching, I will also filter for a country that's nearby. For instance, my dad has another great grandfather who is from Spremberg, Germany, and that's really close to the Czech Republic, and at one time was in the state of Bohemia. And the person this great grandfather married was actually from the opposite side of Germany in Lower Saxony near the Netherlands. And so they're actually from really different parts of Germany. And my dad had a second cousin who had this same set of great grandparents. And I was able to transfer his results to MyHeritage, and I could see the segments where the second cousin was matching my dad. And then I selected for people from the Czech Republic, thinking that anybody who my dad matched from the Czech Republic was likely to only match this one great grandfather because he's the only one from that side. So that's an assumption I was making. But I did find this one really amazing Czech match, and he had all four grandparents from right around that border area. I downloaded his segments and put them up, and then I tried contacting him, and he just took his test off the site. And so I unfortunately did not copy down his family tree, but and that guy was matching my dad like 60 or so centimorgans. So anyway, that was kind of a little heartbreaking, but at least I have his segments and I could see that they were close to overlapping with the second cousin. And so, I could theoretically say that that segment was probably from this great grandfather rather from, another great grandparent. But, I couldn't say for sure. But that was one way I used the features at MyHeritage to try to zero in on a particular great grandfather of mine. So if you have recent German ancestors, it's going to be more complex, but you want to focus maybe a little bit more on where your matches might be from. And think about like the great grandmother who was from Lower Saxony was right next to the Netherlands. And I do notice that my dad has a lot of Dutch matches, and he doesn't have any Dutch ancestry that I know of. And so there's some kind of a chance that those Dutch ancestors would be related to my dad through the grandparents that are right next to the Netherlands. I just love using MyHeritage with ancestors that have more recent European ancestry because I notice it works pretty well even with my mom's Irish side as well, that there's just a lot of Irish people on there and you can tell like specifically what part of Ireland they're from, and sometimes they'll post their trees and so you can make pretty good progress. I think giving it a try is just well worth it for anyone.
What a good idea to use MyHeritage's filtering feature. That's a really interesting idea. I've never tried that, but it makes a lot of sense that if you're going to find some German matches or matches from the Czech Republic, that you can filter based on where somebody currently resides. That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily always going to be valid, but I feel like it's a good way of trying to make sense of all those matches.
Well, and that's what we're trying to do is make sense of our matches. And every single website that has the DNA match results has a different set of tools. And we have to experiment with those and figure out some methodologies for using them. So thanks for cluing us into another fun way to use MyHeritage.
Yeah, I was so glad. I think Germans are a good example of like how can you try to use DNA to get at who your matches might belong to, and I think MyHeritage is the key to doing that.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Heidi, for not only writing the blog post series about tracing your 19th century Germans, but coming on the podcast to talk us through it, because it's always fun to talk about something and then to be able to go read it. And in your blog post, you have so many great links. And in our show notes for this episode, we'll also have links to things that our listeners can go check out. But we just really appreciate you coming on and really appreciate your expertise in this part of genealogy research. We don't have as much experience tracing these Germans.
Well, thanks for giving me the chance. It was so much fun.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our e-course or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.